Hello and welcome back to the third lecture on our World War II series from Mr. Turner's Advanced American History class. Today we are going to be looking, and it's going to be a much shorter lecture than the last time. I'm sorry, that last one ran a little bit long. But today we are going to be looking at the events directly preceding war in Europe. We're going to see the Axis aggression that takes place and starting to take over some of the surrounding countries. And we're also going to briefly take a look at what the United States is doing to face against this growing Nazi threat. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the notes and take a look at what is happening over in Europe. So like I mentioned, at this point, Adolf Hitler has taken full control over Germany. He is the Führer, the main leader, the head of state, the all-encompassing leader of Nazi Germany. Now, Hitler had always mentioned that it was his goal to kind of reunite the German people. And again, I'll remind you that he himself wasn't even German. He was Austrian. But it does kind of show this greater belief he had that the German people existed outside of the borders of Germany, and that it was his goal to basically unite them into a new Third Empire, or a new Third Reich. So the first step in basically expanding the current German borders was to retake some of that land that had been deemed demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. And you can see in this map, this is called the Rhineland. In 1936, Hitler will invade the Rhineland, which was supposed to be kind of a neutral zone between France, Belgium, and Germany. That had been set up by the Treaty of Versailles, and Hitler will go in to the Rhineland, invading that neutral area, that demilitarized zone, and no one does anything. This is going to be a theme today, and I shouldn't laugh about it, because I think the reason the other nations were unwilling to stand up to Germany at this point is you have to put yourself, again, in their place. They are less than 20 years out from the most devastating war that the world had ever seen, and many of them have lost family members in that conflict. They want to avoid this war at all possible. They are willing to avoid war in all costs, and that includes allowing Germany to, frankly, be aggressive here and not do anything to stop them. I think another part of this has to do with the fact that many people saw, as the years went by, that the Treaty of Versailles was very harsh, and that, frankly, it did mistreat Germany, that Germany was being punished. They alone were not the ones that even started the war. So even though they had to sign that guilt clause as a part of the treaty. So I think all of those factors combined kind of explain today's lecture as to why Hitler was able to do so much and take so much land without really any shots being fired. So the invasion of the Rhineland is the first area that Nazi Germany will expand into, and he's testing the waters. And frankly, I think if at any point up until war actually begins, and Hitler actually said this himself, that if they had actually stood up to him and kind of threatened war, I don't know that he was necessarily ready for it at this point. I think he might have stopped, but of course we can always debate the what ifs in history. Part of the fun part about history, though. In 1936, Nazi Germany is going to form an alliance with the fascist state in Italy, and that becomes known as the Rome-Berlin Axis Pact. So I will be referring to the Axis powers in Europe, and that is mainly referring to Germany and Italy. Later on, we will add Japan to that axis, but right now, we're just talking about the alliance between Mussolini and Hitler, the alliance between Italy and Germany. Number 3, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. I know we didn't get too much into Mussolini, but I did mention that his overall goal in a fascist state in Italy was to recreate the glory of the Roman Empire. Italians, a big part of fascism is trying to restore a country's greatness, and that is what Mussolini is trying to do here. He's trying to restore Italy to its former glory at a point where it was the most powerful nation in the world, and to be an empire, you have to have colonies, and so one of the places that Mussolini picks out is one of the weakest areas in the world, and that is one of the last surviving independent nations in Africa, the nation of Ethiopia. In 1935, Italy will launch an invasion of that nation, again, with kind of the goal of starting to restore that Roman Empire. The League of Nations, in fact, the leader of the nation of Ethiopia goes to the League of Nations and begs with them, pleads with them to do something. That, in fact, he very prophetically says that today it is us and tomorrow it will be you. Letting them know, listen, if you don't stand up to these people now, they're going to come after you eventually. And he was absolutely right. But the League of Nations really doesn't have much that they can do. They impose an economic boycott on Italy, but frankly, it just doesn't have that much effect. There is no military wing of the League of Nations. There's not much they can do to, again, put any teeth to these warnings. So very little effect done. Italy is allowed to invade Ethiopia, and that is a devastating war because Ethiopia is a much poorer nation than Italy was, and frankly much more backwards when it comes to military technology. So you got Italy invading with planes and tanks, and Ethiopia is trying to fight a war the same way you would have fought 200 years ago. It's a slaughter. Moving down to number 4, 1936, and this is the first agreement we will see between Germany and Japan, called the Anti-Comintern Pact. And that term Comintern is referring to communist, okay? So basically this is saying the Anti-Communist Pact. Remember that Japan and Russia had fought a war in the early 1900s, the Russo-Japanese War, and it was a brutal conflict for both sides. Japan, up-and-coming nation, they were trying to extend their empire a little bit, and Russia wanted some land in the east. It was just a brutal conflict between those two nations. We mentioned it in last semester's lecture on Teddy Roosevelt. He helped end that conflict and won a Nobel Peace Prize for that. But here in 1936, Germany and Japan find themselves with a common enemy, and that is the Soviet Union. So they signed this pact, basically announcing that they are anti-communist together. But of course, this is very much an anti-Soviet Union pact. And all of a sudden, Russia is starting to get a little bit nervous. I mean, they're watching Germany to the west, they're watching Japan to the east. They're basically sandwiched between these two groups that have just signed a peace agreement, kind of a military pact between those nations. So things are starting, we go back to the causes of World War I. We have already seen a number of those causes. If you remember our lecture on World War I, where we talked about the 4 main causes of World War I, militarism. Definitely already seen that in Germany, and the focus on building up the military. Hitler's one of the first things he did was build up the military forces, and a lot of the national pride was seen in the military there. Alliances, we're talking about that now with Germany and Italy signing that Rome-Berlin Axis Pact, and now the Anti-Comintern Pact. Imperialism, again, Ethiopia, where we're seeing that take place there, and then also nationalism, which of course we've already seen in both Italy and Germany, already extreme and aggressive nationalism. Those exact same reasons that led to the first war are present in this war, and frankly they're compounded by an even greater economic crisis happening during the Great Depression. So the situation is ripe for war, for conflict, and it's a very dangerous time. 1938, number 5, the Anschluss. This is Hitler's largest land grab up until this time, and he is heading back home. Germany will annex Austria. We defined that term annex a few units ago, but to annex a nation means to attach that nation to your own. So what we're saying here is Germany is adding Austria to the German Empire. Okay, and you might say, well, you know, what, did they just kind of allow that to happen? I mean, what's going on there? In a lot of ways, I mean, Austrians, again, Hitler being Austrian himself, a lot of Austrians saw themselves linked culturally with Germany, at different times throughout their history, they had been even parts of the same empire, the Holy Roman Empire, back in the Middle Ages. Austrians, frankly, welcome Hitler and Germany into Austria. They kind of see him as the savior. If anything, Austria was kind of in worse shape than Germany was in some ways, and so they actually welcome them. I'm actually going to go forward a slide here. I should have previewed this. I think I have it. Yes. You might have seen this famous picture before. This is a picture of a woman who's obviously in tears. This is an Austrian woman during the Anschluss. This photograph was published in newspapers all across the world. And, you look at this and, you kind of gain a sense that, as she's giving the Nazi salute, which I will also tell you is something that the Nazis also stole. Another symbol, this was actually originally the Roman salute. This is how in ancient Rome leaders and citizens greeted each other with a hand high in the air. The Nazis stole that as their own, just like the swastika, which has been used throughout many cultures, including Hindu and Buddhist cultures. But you had this picture published throughout newspapers throughout the world, and the image that it conveys is one of this woman almost kind of being forced into this. And I always show this image in my class because if you actually zoom out, you'll notice that the expressions on the faces of those people around her are actually very different, and we may be misconstruing her tears as sadness when in reality it was happiness. I bring this to your attention because I want to bring up the issue of propaganda. Propaganda is going to be used heavily in this war by all sides. Okay, propaganda can be used for bad, but at the basis of it, you are trying to sway people's opinions. You're trying to get them to believe a certain thing, and perhaps in some cases not even telling them the whole truth. In this case, this picture was shown quite a bit, trying to prove to people that the Nazis were forcing their will on Europe, when in reality, in some areas, in some cases, the Nazis were actually welcomed invaders. So, again, propaganda is going to play a key role in this. Let me go back to our original list here. So once again, the German army, I have not given you this term yet, but it is on your term list on that outline. The Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht will actually invade Austria, will not have to fire a single shot, because this is seen as one of Hitler's big goals of reuniting all German-speaking peoples in Europe, and that begins with Austria, trying to bring them back in the fold. The Anschluss, again, Hitler has added a large swath of land to Germany without a single shot being fired, and without another single European country saying or really doing anything about it. Number 6, the Sudetenland and the Munich Pact. So, at this point, Hitler's taken over the Rhineland, Hitler's expanded into Austria, and he's going to kind of test the waters in another area called the Sudetenland. This is a little bit different because he does encounter some resistance for the first time. In one of the newly created nations following the Treaty of Versailles after World War I was the nation of Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia was partly taken from Austria-Hungary, partly taken from Germany, but there were some German-speaking people in Czechoslovakia, especially along those borders with Austria. And Hitler says that those people are under threat, that those people belong in the German Empire, and basically he will invade Czechoslovakia here, trying to get them to come into the German fold. Trying to annex the Sudetenland. But what ends up happening is Czechoslovakia, of course, does not want this region just to go to Germany, and so they begin fighting against them. And the leader of Czechoslovakia announces, listen, we're going to fight you if you invade our country. Now, this is setting off alarm bells all throughout the world. I mean, people are watching Hitler get more and more powerful, that he's doing kind of whatever he wants. And finally here in 1938, you do have some European nations say, wait a second, instead of, we want to avoid war, okay? And so in particular, you have the Prime Minister from England. His name was Neville Chamberlain. He will ask Hitler to meet with him so they can hopefully reach some kind of agreement and keep peace in Europe. And so they decide to meet in the city of Munich, Germany. And when they sit down, ultimately Chamberlain kind of gives in to Hitler's demands. He basically agrees that Hitler can keep the Sudetenland, but he has to make a promise, and that promise is he will quit invading other places. I know. I mean, it's a tough pill to swallow, especially knowing what is coming. And I guess that's a big lesson for us. As we're telling this story, I'm kind of presenting it as, Chamberlain being a fool here, which I guess in a lot of ways he was. But you have to remember, they didn't know what was going to happen. They're trying to keep peace as best as possible. They had no idea that Hitler was going to continue. Probably could have predicted it, but they had no idea he was going to continue invading nations. And in fact, Chamberlain was quite proud of this Munich Pact, got home and in fact came off the airplane, waved it in the air and said, "We will have peace in our time." What his most famous phrase he becomes known for. Now, what Chamberlain has just done is a prime example of a term I would like you to know called appeasement. Okay, this appeasement of Hitler, that term means to give in to an aggressor, okay, to give in to a bully. If you walk to school, I think when you're a little kid, maybe you walk to school, elementary school, and maybe every day you encountered a bully on your way there, who would punch you in the stomach and take your lunch money. Maybe one day you decide you've had enough, and hey, before you get punched in the stomach, you stop the bully and say, "Listen, here's my lunch money for today. Just don't beat me up, and don't beat me up in the future." Well, the bully might take your money, might not punch you that day. Odds are tomorrow it's going to be the exact same thing again, right? Appeasing bullies does not work. And frankly, sometimes they just have to get punched in the mouth. And in this case, Hitler needed to get punched in the mouth, and that was not happening. They were giving in to his demands, and all they were requiring from Hitler was basically a pinky promise. Well, you can't really trust a Nazi. Well, anyways, by March of 1939, within a few short months of this pact being signed, you have Germany actually occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia, which is often a fact we kind of ignore. We focus so much on the invasion of Poland. But yeah, he takes the Sudetenland and then really kind of invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. So, I mean, within even a few short months of the Munich Pact, I mean, Hitler's back at it, and invading and annexing other places. But on your test, boy, it would be a great question if I asked you, what is a good example of appeasement? I would remember this part, so wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Say no more, say no more. Number 7, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was named after the diplomats from Russia and Germany that would sign this secret agreement, or at least it had a secret component to it. In 1939, the nations of Germany and the Soviet Union would sign a non-aggression pact. Now, you might say, wait a second, I thought you just said that Germany was signing agreements that were anti-communist, and they did, okay? But here they're signing an agreement with the communists of the Soviet Union. That is the case. Here's the deal. Although they absolutely despised one another, hated each other, did not trust one another, they both had some common interests, and that common interest was Poland. The nation of Poland had been created out of the Treaty of Versailles, and it had been created using land from both Germany and Russia. They want that land back, and a part of this agreement was actually secretive. It was not known to the public at the time, but in this treaty between this non-aggression pact, and by the way, that's not like a peace treaty, that's not saying it's an alliance or anything. A non-aggression pact means that they just agree not to fight one another. Okay, you don't have to like each other to not fight one another. So that's all they're signing here. But there's a secret agreement made that they will split Poland. Right? They make an agreement that they set the date for September 1st. They are going to invade Poland from both sides. The Soviets coming in from the east and the Germans coming in from the west. And they're basically going to take their land back. So once again, I think kind of the failures of the previous generation are, resulting here. The Soviets felt slighted by the treaty. The Germans felt slighted by the treaty that gave up their land. They saw people in Poland as being, Russians and Germans, and they wanted that land back. By the way, many people in Poland would probably see themselves, of course, as being Polish, which historically had been a major kingdom in Europe in previous centuries. But the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a major moment where Russia and Germany agree not to fight one another and to basically split Poland. And that will come to being. Now, I want to remind you back to World War I. I know I'm pulling back a lot of information you learned back in November, but here's the deal. When the fighting broke out in World War I want you to remember, what was Germany's biggest problem when fighting broke out in World War I? Well, they're surrounded from the very beginning of that war. You had France on the western side, and you had Russia on the eastern side. Now, what this pact has just done is eliminate that big threat on their eastern border. Okay, if they actually trust the Soviets enough to uphold this pact, to not become aggressive, and they just agree to split Poland, well, now all of a sudden Germany does not have to worry about their eastern border like they did in World War I. Hitler has just solved the biggest problem for the German military that they have had over the last, well, really forever. So that is going to be a big part of why this war comes about when it does, the actions that Germany will take, because once war breaks out, we're going to see that Hitler is able to throw his full fighting force completely at France. They are going to fall within a month, and he does not have to worry about Russia, not yet. Remember, you are dealing with two megalomaniacs in Stalin and Hitler, two men that are perhaps two of the most paranoid men to ever have walked this earth. They don't trust each other, and for good reason. They were both evil madmen, and it's just a matter of time before one of them betrays the other. Again, foreshadowing here. All right, for the last section of these notes here, I want to cover what's happening in the United States. America is watching this unfold. We are recognizing that things are starting to get out of hand in Europe. But there's a problem that is happening. There's a kind of a disconnect because FDR, President Roosevelt, I think he truly recognized, he was not necessarily pro-war, but I think he recognized that things were starting to spiral out of control. And I think FDR really wanted to start lending some aid to our allies like Britain and France. And he wanted to, come out against Germany and Hitler. But it was very unpopular at this time. America, more so than most countries in the world, want to avoid another conflict. I will remind you that when polled, about 70% of Americans had said that joining World War I had been a mistake. They thought that war, even though we were on the winning side of that war, that war had been a mistake. Now, if you're president, you have to take that into account. You have to take into account that the people don't want us involved in this war, even though it might be the right thing to do. So the popularity of this conflict that is about to erupt is very low. And frankly, you have those ideas of pacifism that we talked about and non-intervention, okay, still right there at the forefront. Very popular sentiments. And that was best seen in what became known as the America First Committee. This was an organization that had different chapters set up around the country in which people, in fact, there were over 1 million people in this organization. This was a non-interventionist group that said we need to focus on America's problems first and not get bogged down in any European wars. And again, there's nothing wrong with that sentiment. That's a good thing, I think, most of the time. But most of the time, we're not dealing with a Hitler who is about to take over the world. Frankly, looking back on it, I mean, even though the ideas behind the American First Committee probably are in the best, place. Ultimately, that bully's going to come around and punch you in the stomach and get your lunch money again, and you have to be ready for that. So what didn't help was that a lot of major celebrities even got involved with this. In fact, probably the biggest celebrity that was putting their voice behind the America First movement was Charles Lindbergh, who was maybe the biggest celebrity in the United States and perhaps the world at the time. The first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. He was a major celebrity, and he is standing there giving speeches at the America First rallies and saying, we don't necessarily need to deal with, we don't need to worry about the Nazis or Japan. Like, we got a lot of problems here that we need to deal with. Now, I do want to mention that perhaps some of this may be a little bit. I think Charles Lindbergh might have been covering up some other beliefs that he had. He did not necessarily talk about this too openly. He did a few times, but all accounts, I think most historians would agree that that Lindbergh himself was actually an anti-Semite, that he did not like the Jewish people, and in fact he would say as much. I shouldn't beat around the bush, because he was an anti-Semite. In fact, he gave a speech in Des Moines, I think in 1938 or 39, in which he basically talked about like the Jewish conspiracy, like to take over the world, and everybody's like, "What is he talking about?" But sadly, those ideas had invaded the United States. Even Henry Ford was another well-known figure that was a very open anti-Semite. So anti-Semitism was here. There was even a Nazi party that had formed in the United States. In fact, I wish I had it pulled up here, but in fact, in 1938, they had a rally in New York City. It is the most like backward scene you can imagine, just like Hitler's rallies in Germany, but this one was taking place in Madison Square Garden with swastikas everywhere, 10,000 people strong, and a big portrait of George Washington at the front, in which they kind of claimed that Washington, in their mind, was kind of the first fascist leader of the United States, and that's a whole another issue. I'm getting way off topic here, but it's a fascinating topic in my mind. So you did have anti-Semitism here, and that often, sometimes people used that and kind of covered it up by saying America first. In reality, they're all pro-Germany, but they're saying America first, allow Germany kind of do their own thing, keep us out of that war. Number two, the quarantine speech. So again, I want to return to this idea that FDR understands that we need to get involved in this conflict. These countries need our help that Hitler is threatening, but he also understands that he cannot just throw the full weight of the American government behind those countries or against Germany. And so what he starts to do is kind of slowly, introduce some policies. And in 1937, he calls for quarantining aggressive nations. So, and quite literally use those words, quarantining of aggressor nations. And, not having to specifically say it, but Germany, Japan, who's been at war at this point for 6 years, saying that America should quarantine them, that they should basically put economic pressure on these countries to kind of force them from committing these acts of violence. So, in some ways, he's starting to kind of inch closer towards American involvement here, but just basically by saying we shouldn't trade with those nations, we should put some economic pressure on them to try and get them to stop doing what they're doing. It wasn't enough. It wouldn't make that big of an impact, but we're starting to slowly ease away from isolationism and towards interventionism. Number three, the Neutrality Acts, 1939. And this was a series of laws that were kind of covered a couple different areas. Perhaps the biggest thing of these Neutrality Acts that I would like you to know was that in one of them there was what was called a cash and carry provision. A cash and carry, which allowed the president to sell materials, including war materials, tanks and planes and all that stuff, to countries that basically promised to pay in cash. Okay, so the cash and carry, and promised to come get the goods. We would not deliver them. They had to come get the goods and take them back to their home country. So, basically, this was another way that we could kind of get involved and help out. I mean, we were very selective on who we actually sold supplies to, but this was another way that the United States could get involved and basically kind of help out the Allies, but without getting fully involved in the war. So the Neutrality Act's declaring our neutrality. Perhaps I did not mention that. That's kind of the biggest thing. Hey, we're neutral. But as a side note, we are willing to sell goods to other nations, but they have to pay cash, and they have to come carry them away themselves. So we are inching closer towards war, and by the end of 1939, the war itself in Europe would start. In fact, next lecture, that is how we're going to begin with the war in Europe being unleashed. Guys, thank you so much for paying attention, and I hope you found today's lecture to be stimulating. And as always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'm happy to get back to you. Thanks a lot.